this would be for the people who really had issues with Elena, and really had issues with Yun. There were a lot of complaints about those two characters in particular, that they were, fairly scrubby and just kind of ruined the game. And this would basically not be a top to bottom rebalance and stuff, but just kind of hitting those major sore thumbs. And again, those complaints were prevalent, but are those complaints so prevalent that they would keep people from playing the game again? That is a question that Capcom would have to answer if it's worthwhile rebalancing this game.
As I sit and think and feel about it, honestly, I don't need it.
Yeah.
It'd be good. You'd have to sell me on that Street Fighter 4 was back and was so playable that I would devote time, and then it's like, okay, maybe now I want to. But that almost feels like you're developing a whole new game, and that starts to get weird.
Focusing on Third Strike, and I actually could not vote for a rebalance harder here, where I'm more on the fence with Ultra Street Fighter 4. Third Strike's balance is terrible. Absolutely freaking terrible, but the gameplay is actually really good. And so what I would do with Third Strike is I would reduce damage on Chun-Li's SA2, her, basically super lightning legs thing that you see a million times in every matchup. And then
Moment 37, right?
Yeah, and then Yun's Genijin.
Grandfathered into the place that it is, where it's become accepted despite its flaws. And then to go back and mess with that, it's almost like there's this, you don't mess with antiques.
Yeah.
It's yes, it's not, we've learned how to do it better, but don't, because then you're changing its identity, and we're more in love with its identity at this point than we are the particulars of how it flows.
All right, John, balance is the subject of the day, right? I want to talk about, if Capcom should rebalance Ultra Street Fighter 4 and Third Strike, plus some older games. And you want to deal here, getting into it, people are like, okay, this is the premise of the 35th anniversary, which I've talked about, where you put all the games on there, right? And going back, should those games kind of basically be rebalanced? I don't want to go with each individual game, we're going to talk about Third Strike. I don't want to talk about Second Impact, because Second Impact already got rebalanced. That was Third Strike. Those games, this is basically going back and doing it again. So this is a resource intensive process and is expensive as well. We've gotten quotes from Capcom on this, and they're like, look, rebalancing sounds fun and all that, but there's a lot of work that goes into it. So I personally want to start here with the most interesting game, in my opinion, and that would be Ultra Street Fighter 4. I think the balance of that game is already really good, and yet I would still advocate for a few tweaks, especially to stuff like Elena's healing, maybe having that recover less life overall, and then probably reducing Yun's damage again, because they gave him some inexplicable buffs towards the end of Ultra Street Fighter 4, which is what are you doing? This is one of the best characters in the game, and you gave him buffs, right? But I want to go right to Ultra Street Fighter 4, because immediately, John, we've run polls on our website. You and I talk about it. This is the culmination. This is the best balanced, in my opinion, Street Fighter game they've ever made. This is a terrific game, but I'm also talking with a long-suffering Gouken player here, and I'm curious, would you want to see Ultra Street Fighter 4 rebalanced with, the rollback code is a given, right? This is going to be a rollback code version of the game if we get our wish. Do you want to see Capcom tweak it further?
This is interesting because, of course, if you want the game to be better, then you would want it to be further refined, and you want them to spend a little more time, now that they've learned more about fighting games in general, fine-tuning the product. At the same time, older grandfathered fighting games tend to have this not quite nostalgia about them, but people accept them because they are from the era that they are in, and there is a certain understanding of what balance should and shouldn't be, and it's just that's what they are. They're grandfathered in, even though there are egregious problems balance-wise with Street Fighter 2, and if that game came out today, people would just laugh at it and say, that's not even a thing, what are you doing here? But because it's Street Fighter 2, people are okay with it, and they just work around and deal with and just accept that there are ridiculous high tiers, and there are some matchups that at the highest levels feel just about unwinnable for certain characters, and that's weirdly accepted. Now, because that's the case, I have to wonder, well, is the risk reward here worth it? You said it's an expensive process, and these are older titles, and people will accept them. Street Fighter 4 might not quite be at that same status as the likes of Street Fighter 3, 2, Alpha, all of that kind of, or all of those older games, because it's still kind of, it was just one generation ago. So maybe people feel a little bit differently about that. But as I sit and think and feel about it, honestly, I don't need it.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it'd be good. You'd have to sell me on that Street Fighter 4 was back and was so playable that I would devote time, and then it's like, okay, maybe now I want to, but that almost feels like you're developing a whole new game, and that starts to get weird
Yeah.
because you're also going to have the new Street Fighter game to play. I mean, there's a crowd for SF4, and I think they run regular online tournaments and such. And I hear that Blockbuster John and Brent are like the two people to beat in the American scene right now. So good on. I hope those guys are doing well. Obviously, they are in Street Fighter 4. So I'm not sold. I'm not against it, but I'm not sold because it sounds expensive and maybe like something that people just don't necessarily want. But of the games, I would say Street Fighter 4 has the best. You could make the best argument for it.
Yeah. I this is a controversial pick for me in terms of like, because I don't really like Street Fighter 4. I'm never going to play the game again if I can avoid it. I think the game has aged super poorly. And even if they
got them invincible backdashes, baby.
Yeah, I play the freaking. I play Rose, who's the most disgusting on that end. It just. For me, it's so there's a crossroads here. When they did the Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix rebalance, there were a number of players who were very excited about it, and it got played very heavily initially, and then everyone went back to Super Turbo. And they're like, no, like we're good, kind of thing. So So
the fact that happened, first of all, is probably a big indicator to Capcom. Is like, all right, well, we can spend this much time, and that's with giving it a whole new graphical overhaul and such. It's like put Street Fighter 4 in the what's the engine we're moving towards now, into the RE engine. I mean, sure, but that's even more.
That's a ton of work. Yeah,
I bet.
Yeah. So it's
risk reward.
I would personally be in favor of it with Street Fighter 4, but just with the caveat of like, I'm not a big time Street Fighter 4 player, and probably the more competitive hardcore community would like to see the game exactly where it's at right now, just with rollback code. So that might make the answer for
So what happens though? Okay, so it's not for you. Then who's it for, and what happens for those people when this gets updated?
This would be for the people who really had issues with Elena, and really had issues with Yun. There were a lot of complaints about those two characters in particular, that they were, fairly scrubby and just kind of ruined the game. And this would basically not be a top to bottom rebalance and stuff, but just kind of hitting those major sore thumbs. And again, those complaints were prevalent, but are those complaints so prevalent that they would keep people from playing the game again? That is a question that Capcom would have to answer if it's worthwhile rebalancing this game.
I just feel like it's been so long that I didn't want to jump off of Street Fighter 4 when 5 came out. I wanted to play both at the same time, and I think there were a lot of people in that camp. Street Fighter 4 still had juice in it, but even I, being one of those people in that camp, at this point, I'm like, it's going to take a lot for me to while also playing whatever the modern Street Fighter is, to go back and play 4 and really embrace it for that. And I guess it's because I'm not, thinking about it in terms of like, I'm just playing to have fun. It's like I have a certain amount of time in my day and things I need to do, and a certain amount of time I can devote to playing games. And so maybe I'm coming more from that place than the average person. But yeah, it's a hard sell.
Yeah. So I'm going to officially put up a graphic here, John. Your vote for Street Fighter 4 is no.
I guess it is.
Yeah. Mine is a yes, but it's a kind of a soft yes. So moving on, I want to go back a little bit further, and we have Third Strike. As I mentioned, we're ignoring Second Impact and New Generation here, and just focusing on Third Strike. And I actually could not vote for a rebalance harder here, where I'm more on the fence with Ultra Street Fighter 4. Third Strike's balance is terrible. Absolutely freaking terrible, but the gameplay is actually really good. And so what I would do with Third Strike is I would reduce damage on Chun-Li's SA2, her, basically super lightning legs thing that you see a million times in every matchup. And then like
moment 37, right?
Yeah. And then Yun's Genijin. I would actually reduce the damage on both those things, because the big problem with Third Strike is there's about 8 cast members who saw regular tournament appearances in a little less than half. And that is just that's really bad. And when you started, seeing like 5 Chun-Li mirrors in a row at the most competitive of levels, that's just a really bad look for the game. And this one is a sore thumb game, if you ask me. This is one of the things where it's like, if Capcom is going to rebalance anything, it would, in my opinion, have to be this game. But you go to the purist again out there, and they're like, look, this is like the Grandmaster Street Fighter game, and it is defined in the community as the best Street Fighter ever for some people. Why are you altering it at all? and
It's that golden sort of a thing, and people have pushed through maybe the frustrations of the imbalanced aspects of it to just appreciate it as it is, and it's kind of got this sort of aura about it. And again, it's like grandfathered into the place that it is, where it's become accepted despite its flaws. And then to go back and mess with that, it's almost like there's this, like, you don't mess with antiques.
yeah.
It's like, yes, it's not, we've learned how to do it better, but don't, because then you're changing its identity, and we're more in love with its identity at this point than we are the particulars of how it flows.
John, quoting Pawn Stars, I've been watching that quite a bit on YouTube, and they're like, if you mess with an antique or you like restore it and stuff like that, sometimes it hurts its value a ton. So there's a case right there for it, but I'm not going to use Pawn Star logic here. I'm actually going to go the other direction and just say, like, watching these tournaments and competing in them, just knowing you're going to face 5 Chun-Li players in a row, that's terrible. Like that is a unique problem to Third Strike, that I would make the case that, like, that is really something you need to attend to with the super top tiers, which is Yun and Chun-Li. If you touched nothing but those 2 characters, I think the game would be quite a bit better just by nerfing those 2 down just a bit. Just the damage on Chun-Li's super art to the lightning legs, like literally just toning down the damage of that and the gain engine would make the game so much better, and so many matchups would be a lot more playable, and that's not huge tweaks. I'm not talking about getting every cast member. I'm really just talking about dealing with the very obvious sore thumbs that have been there for a couple decades now.
hmm Yeah, and that's a very different thing than like an overhaul balance patch like we see with Street Fighter V currently, which what's probably coming up in March, right? And I think that's an important distinction to make, so people know we're talking only about 1 or 2 of the most egregious errors about it. If that only takes, a relatively short amount of time and money and effort from Capcom, and it would be something that they could clearly see is widely going to be accepted as just fine and ultimately making the game better, at the same time not turning a bunch of people off because you're messing with an antique,
Yep.
something like that, then okay, fine. Like, sure. I don't know that anyone's asking for this game to get better, but if you can make it better without pissing anybody off, and it doesn't cost a lot, I don't have an issue with that. And I would apply that same thing to Street Fighter 4. I apply that to all of these games. But that's, I don't know how easy of an achievement that is, especially when you're in the murky waters of, like, well, how will people react to this?
Yeah.
It's like you got to know, and it's hard to know.
All right, John, what's your final answer on Third Strike balance? What do you think? Rebalanced? Yes or no?
Okay, fine.
Okay. I'm a hard yes on this one. I just played against Yun and Chun-Li for too many years, and just altering those 2 characters alone, I would actually pick up and play Third Strike a bit more again. It would be fun to get there. But next we go down to Alpha 3, and this is a monster of a game to tackle because of the ism system. Every character has 3 different isms that you can choose, and you might be able to do a few things to tweak this game, but this is also a title, Alpha 3, that did not hold up well from a competitive standpoint. And its predecessor, Alpha 2, which we'll talk about here in a second, it was actually often looked more favorably by the competitive community overall. Like, it was like, you can play Alpha 3, but why not play Alpha 2? It's a better game. So my vote here, getting to it very quickly, is a hard no. Alpha 3 is just too much of a monster to take on. Like, you could do it, but it's like, what is the return on investment going to be? And I don't think it's going to be very good. So hard no here for Alpha 3.
Sounds like a Super Smash Bros. Brawl and melee type of ordeal. Maybe just not as pronounced and huge as the Super Smash example. But yeah, I mean, if the third game actually was, well, a failure to the extent that the community went back to the second game, then maybe we should talk about rebalancing the second game again or something along those lines. But as you said, that's not something that's on the table. I have no problem skipping over Alpha 3 for this.
Well, speaking of Alpha 2, people are going to think I've gone a little bit crazy here because I'm actually going to be asking for Rose nerfs. But I think Capcom's time would be better spent on Ultra Street Fighter 4 and Street Fighter 3 here, to be clear. But if they're going to hit some of the older games as well, Alpha 2 is the one I would look at, particularly like the utility and the frame data of some of the normals. Like Rose's crouching medium punch is legendary in that game. Just like making some of the frame data on this stuff like match what modern expectations are, so you just kind of can't spam away with these moves. A lot of old school players especially would be like, oh, you've just ruined the heart of the game, especially with this new change I'm about to mention, like reducing custom combo damage down. That is one of the most explosive and crazy things you will see, because you can do, like, there's 100% combos, like with custom combos and all that kind of stuff that you can pull off. They're not easy to do, you don't see them all the time, but yeah. This game Alpha 2 feels a little bit more viable to me than tweaking Alpha 3, but even then I'd actually vote no here because I think the game holds up just fine as is. If you've got a game this old, Alpha 2, and people are still playing it, it's probably good enough as it is.
Yeah, that kind of is where I keep going back to, or I find myself keep going back to. It's like if people are still embracing these games as they exist, and they've pushed through that whole obstacle of the imbalance is going to turn me off. It's like they're still playing it already. You could make their lives better, but if they're not overwhelmingly asking for it, and maybe Capcom puts out some polls or has a way of measuring just how much the desire for this is. I suspect there's not a ton of it. But if there were, then maybe they could justify it. But again, I'm really erring towards the side of this is not something that's asked for, needed, and it might do some good. It might do more harm than good in terms of the people's relationship with these games. So maybe the efforts and the mana is better spent developing and further refining the modern games as opposed to going back. But I don't think that it's a terrible idea. And there's of course some really cool benefits that would come from, hey, it's Street Fighter 4 and Elena doesn't have her BS anymore. It's like, what would that game look like? Well, maybe it'd be pretty cool, you know. And so there is some benefit. It's just I don't know that the cost justifies it.
Yeah, and then there's Alpha 1. That never really got much play in the competitive scene, and that's for good reason. I just leave that game alone and let it be what it's going to be. Why tweak why polish up a turd, basically? So the original Alpha 1 is not a good competitive game. So we get into the Street Fighter 2 series now, and that was actually already rebalanced a ton, even as recently as 2008. So I think this one is fairly heavily resolved as well. I would throw HD Remix into the package if possible, so it's there if people want to have it to mess around with. But honestly though, if there's a game that doesn't need to be rebalanced, it's Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. It is just it's one of the longest running, most played games in the entire FGC, and keeping the exact balance and other stuff that we had is just, it's totally fine. That game has proven through the time that it's good to go. So yeah.
If anything, make it more broken. Just do Omega mode, Rainbow mode, whatever. Make that the standard. Yeah. Just actually, let's go back and answer all these break them more.
Yeah.
Just go crazy. That's what we should do.
Lastly, we've got Street Fighter 1, which we can throw out because it's never been a competitive game. It's actually more of an endurance test to see who can get less frustrated at the controls. There's literally no point in touching that one. Oh my goodness. So as we said, John, like they're rebalancing these games can be on the more expensive side, unless you have, in my opinion, just a handful of tweaks to do, because you're literally talking back, going into the assembly code and tweaking a few variables and other stuff in there. Tweaking damage is not the hardest thing ever, and then playtesting that, like, it can be done. But if you're going to go and heavily rebalance the game, oh my gosh, you're talking about massive amounts of effort. So it's there it is. I'm really curious what our audience thinks of this, so please leave a comment below on each of the games that we've discussed and anything that you guys could think that would be a really good thing to look at. We'll be checking them out.
Sounds good.